Ukraine is introducing a tax on murder and has finally come to its senses about the EU association agreement. And Russia deported the Crimean Tatars because of treason. Welcome to StopFake, the place where we dissect this kind of disinformation about Ukraine and a little more. So let's get to it. The topic of Ukraine's integration with the European Union is always a target of media manipulation and disinformation. Most of the themes center on the idea that Ukraine doesn't belong in Europe, neither economically or politically or even culturally. Recently, Russian media announced that Ukraine is about to revise its association agreement with the European Union. The headline of the conservative Orthodox site Tsargrad blared, "They came to their senses 6 years later. Why Ukraine wants to revise the EU agreement that Maidan stood for." Now, Ukrainian Deputy Prime Minister for European and Euro-Atlantic Integration Vadim Prystaiko has in fact expressed the need to revise the terms of the EU Association Agreement, in particular those regarding quotas and tariffs. But there is no talk of pulling out of the agreement or changing it in any significant way, particularly because the European Union remains Ukraine's largest trading partner. Asked how Ukrainian legislation was being adapted to the terms of the association agreement in an interview with the German broadcaster Deutsche Welle's Ukrainian service, Prystaiko said now was the right time to adjust Ukraine's laws because the 10-year period when the treaty conditions could be revised is fast approaching. Ukraine's manufacturers expect some revisions, Prystaiko said, as most of the quotas set forth in the association agreement no longer satisfy Ukraine's needs. Other spheres of the economic cooperation that Ukraine is looking to revise and expand with the EU include the digital market, customs, justice, security, and defense sectors. During the interview, Prystaiko did not talk about any disadvantage or inequality in the association agreement. He only focused on tariffs and quotas, which Ukraine intends to increase. In 2019, bilateral trade between the European Union and Ukraine amounted to 44.4 billion euros. The European Union is Ukraine's main trading partner, making up 42% of Ukraine's foreign trade. Ukraine introduced a war tax in 2015, and several Facebook trolls have been asking, is there still a country in the world where people pay for the killing of their own people? Russia's federal news agency, meanwhile, claims that there is no such thing as a war tax in Ukraine, but the government is indeed poised to enact just such a tax. Well, both claims are false. Military fees, or war taxes, are a widespread practice throughout the world, and Ukraine has had such a tax since 2014. Ukraine introduced a military tax in the summer of 2014 in the wake of Russia's invasion and annexation of Ukraine's Crimean Peninsula and its invasion and occupation of Ukraine's eastern Donbass. After Ukraine's President Viktor Yanukovych fled to Russia, Ukraine's treasury was almost empty and its armed forces greatly reduced and in disarray. The military tax was presented as a temporary levy which was extended pending upon the completion of Ukraine's military reform. A tax of 1.5% is levied against each taxpayer's income. However, pensioners and people with low income are exempt. In their eagerness to produce ever new fakes intended to compromise Ukraine, some Russian propagandists have become muddled in their own fakes, while others trip over their own disinformation. They claim that the April anti-crisis legislation that was signed by President Volodymyr Zelensky into law in May introduces new taxes to finance the war and the fight against COVID-19. But the reality is the law provides tax and administration relief for businesses during the coronavirus pandemic. In particular, the law states that doctors are exempt from paying taxes during the coronavirus lockdown, and state unemployment benefits are not subject to personal income tax nor the military levy. So, contrary to the trolls' claims, no new taxes are being introduced, but rather existing ones are actually being reduced. As for Russia's endless claims that Ukraine is murdering its own citizens and the war in Ukraine is a civil war, they have been exposed as lies by the world community many times over. And I'm going to go off on a tangent here, but even though Ukraine has repeatedly cited evidence of Russian participation in the war in eastern Donbass, publications like The Washington Post continue to use the term civil war in their coverage of Ukraine, thereby propagating the Russian disinformation narrative. To their credit, the editors have now included a clarification that reads, quote, "An earlier version of this article referred to the fighting in eastern Ukraine as a quote-unquote civil war, a term that some experts and many Ukrainians reject as an inaccurate portrayal of the conflict. But let's be honest, this kind of clarification basically uses journalistic objectivity to beat away the facts. And the fact is that Russia was firing Grad rockets from Russia into Ukraine. For the Washington Post to refer to Russia's war against Ukraine as a civil war, and then to suggest that experts find the use of that term inaccurate, is a serious blow to their reputation. In January 2017, Ukraine filed a lawsuit with the United Nations International Court of Justice to hold Russia accountable for acts of terrorism and discrimination against Ukraine. The court papers filed include hundreds of pages of facts about Russian aggression, evidence of the illegal annexation of Crimea, and the occupation of eastern Donbass. In addition, in April of 2018, the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe officially recognized Russia as guilty of the occupation of Ukraine's Donbass. Since 2014, the United States, the European Union, and a number of other states have supported a series of sanctions against Russia because of Moscow's aggression against Ukraine. In May 1944, more than 400,000 Crimean Tatars were forcibly deported from Crimea. Half of the deportees died and one-third of them were children. According to some historians, the real reason for the deportation was that the USSR sought to seize part of Turkey and establish control over the Bosphorus Strait. To do this, Moscow ethnically cleansed Crimea and the Caucasus. Turks were evicted from the Caucasus and Crimean Tatars were deported from Crimea. Russian propaganda, however, continues to peddle Stalin's narrative of treason, that Red Army desertions and cooperation with the Nazis are the reasons for the mass deportations. A pro-Kremlin Russian-language Baltic site, rubaltic.ru, published an article listing all sorts of fakes that have been making the rounds since the days of the USSR. For example, that there were allegedly existing eyewitness accounts of how Crimean Tatars convinced Russian fighters to abandon their combat positions, promising to hide them in their villages. Some Russian media claim that allegedly the fact of mass collaboration is difficult to challenge, but that the leadership of the USSR had legitimate reasons to act as it did. Now, on May the 11th, 1944, the USSR State Defense Committee passed a resolution ordering the expulsion, quote, of all Tatars from the territory of Crimea and their permanent settlement as special settlers in Uzbekistan. Charges of betraying the motherland and deserting the Red Army are untrue, as some 17,000 Crimean Tatars actually served in the Red Army, and most of them did so throughout the entire war. After the Soviet 51st Army was defeated in Crimea, conscripts of many different nationalities fled, including Crimean Tatars. Radio Liberty's Crimean Realities program quotes a soldier from the 51st Army who described how short of weapons they were in 1941. Quote, 18 rifles were distributed. The remaining 700 soldiers in the battalion faced the Germans with shovels and pickaxes. Mortars and machine guns were broken and unusable, he said. Accusing the Crimean Tatars of treason and total collaboration is also untrue and basically wrong. Historians note that in the Soviet territories occupied by Nazi Germany, it's impossible to find someone or some group who could not be accused of collaborating with the Nazis. According to historian Serhiy Hremenko, the Tatar battalions who fought on the side of the Germans consisted of only 15 to 16,000 people, some 6.5% to 7% of the entire population. Most of these people were killed during the war or at the end of the war ended up in the gulags. The local population who cooperated with Nazi Germany did so in order to protect their villages from Soviet partisans who persecuted them because of their nationality. At the same time, about 15% of the Crimean Tatar male population fought on the side of Soviet Russia's Red Army. Demographic figures for Crimea are the most revealing, according to Hremenko, and they completely challenge and question Moscow's traditional myths about Crimean Tatars. For example, there were a total of 232,000 Crimean Tatars in Crimea at the start of World War II. 18,000 were killed, died, or went missing. Of those, 11,000 to 12,000 were on the side of the USSR, while 6,000 to 7,000 were on the side of Germany. 9,500 were arrested for collaborating with Germany, 194,000 were deported from Crimea, 9,000 were demobilized, and 1,500 emigrated. The resettlement of Crimean Tatars to Uzbekistan and other areas had disastrous consequences. Between 15 and 46% died of hunger and disease during the winter of 1944 to 1945. Over the next 2 years, a policy of systematic Russification was put in place, changing more than 80% of all Crimean Tatar names to standard Soviet, Russian names, stripping Crimea of its autonomy, and turning the Crimean Peninsula into a Russian province. That's it for this week. You can find much more dissected disinformation on our website, StopFake.org. Look out for fakes and don't listen to Russian disinformation, because washing your hands and social distancing will in fact protect you from the coronavirus. And as always, if you spot any disinformation about Ukraine, forward it to us for a truth autopsy. I'm Marko Suprun, and this is StopFake. Thanks for watching.